Bom dia a todos e todas. É com grande satisfação que eu declaro aberta essa aula inaugural da Cátedra Sérgio Vieira de Mello, da UFMG, em parceria com a Acnur. Eu gostaria de começar cumprimentando o professor Aziz Saliba, nosso diretor de Relações Internacionais, na pessoa de quem eu cumprimento todos os demais membros da equipe da DRI, que tem organizado e cuidado desse projeto, dessa cátedra, com tanto carinho. Agradeço também pela organização deste evento. Eu gostaria de cumprimentar o senhor William Laureano, que nos dá a honra de sua presença aqui hoje, nessa aula inaugural, representando justamente a Acnur, que é a nossa parceira nesse importante projeto para a nossa instituição. E cumprimento também a professora Carolina Mulan, professora da Faculdade de Ciências Econômicas e coordenadora da Cátedra Sérgio Vieira de Mello. Um agradecimento especial, professora Carolina, por ter aceito esse trabalho de coordenar essa cátedra que tem importância para nós aqui da UFMG e também para o nosso país. Eu gostaria também de cumprimentar a professora Cláudia Maiorga, que é a nossa pró-reitora de extensão, que acompanhou e que trouxe para nós essa proposta, dessa possibilidade dessa cátedra há algum tempo já, e nós temos, ao longo desses anos, feito esforços para implementar essa cátedra, porque entendemos que é um passo muito importante para todos nós. Eu gostaria de começar essa breve fala mencionando que se por um lado é um momento especial para nós, ao estarmos abrindo esse evento que inaugura as atividades da Cátedra Sérgio Vieira de Mello, por um lado, que é uma cátedra muito almejada pela nossa instituição, por um lado, é também um momento de luto para todos nós aqui da UFMG e para o nosso país também, quando completamos 200 mil mortos pela Covid-19. Então, vai aqui a minha solidariedade a todas as pessoas que perderam entes queridos nessa pandemia, todos aqueles também que passaram por momentos muito difíceis durante esse período que já se arrasta por muitos meses. Essa, nós sabemos, não apenas a maior crise sanitária dos últimos 100 anos, mas também a maior crise social da história da humanidade nos últimos anos. Uma crise que tem afetado principalmente as populações e as pessoas mais vulneráveis do nosso país e também do mundo como um todo. Principalmente, nós temos tido um impacto enorme nas populações mais pobres, indígenas, quilombolas, nas mulheres, na população negra. Então, tem, de fato, atingido essas populações de forma dramática, e somos todos muito solidários a tudo que tem passado a nossa sociedade nesse momento tão difícil. A UFMG tem procurado atender as demandas da sociedade, dar um pouco mais de conforto a essas pessoas que têm passado por esses momentos. E, claro, entre as pessoas que têm sofrido fortemente com essa pandemia, estão aí incluídos os refugiados em situação extremamente precária em várias regiões do planeta. Isso faz com que essa cátedra sendo inaugurada nesse momento, ela tenha um papel muito importante para a nossa instituição e para uma reflexão aprofundada que todos nós devemos fazer sobre a situação dos refugiados, de um modo geral, mas principalmente no contexto dessa pandemia que nós estamos vivendo. E essa atividade inaugural da cátedra acontece também em um momento muito importante para a UFMG, que lançou esta semana um importante edital com 77 vagas em vários de seus cursos de graduação para estrangeiros em situação de vulnerabilidade, incluindo aí refugiados, asilados políticos, apátridas, portadores de vistos temporários e outros que necessitam dessa acolhida humanitária que é nosso dever como instituição promover. E nós, a UFMG, ela já foi pioneira na abertura dessas vagas para refugiados em cursos de graduação, quando lançou pela primeira vez, em 2004, uma resolução para a acolhida desses refugiados em nossa instituição. E esse edital, ele amplia essas situações de vulnerabilidades para estrangeiros e também, de uma certa forma, regulamenta esse processo de acolhimento nessas condições para toda a universidade, para as 77 vagas que são oferecidas nesse contexto. Então, para nós, é um momento especial também podermos comemorar essa cátedra com um evento, com esse edital que para nós é muito importante, que marca de forma simbólica, mas também de forma concreta, a nossa acolhida a esses estrangeiros, a esses refugiados que necessitam, nesse momento, dessa acolhida humanitária mais do que nunca. Com a implementação desta cátedra e também com essa resolução que nós aprovamos em 2019 e que está sendo implementada pela primeira vez agora, a UFMG amplia justamente a nossa acolhida na inclusão não apenas de refugiados, mas também de todos aqueles que necessitam dessa acolhida humanitária, como eu mencionei, e a UFMG, ao fazer esse movimento, ela faz uma importante reflexão sobre os direitos humanos, sobre a política de direitos humanos da nossa instituição e também consolida a sua política de inclusão. Nós temos que pensar na inclusão e na política de direitos humanos de forma ampliada, contemplando todos aqueles que necessitam da atuação da universidade para que possam ser incluídos de forma completa na sociedade e também e principalmente na nossa instituição. E a UFMG, mais uma vez, com muito orgulho, cumprindo a sua missão como uma instituição pública, de qualidade, de relevância para a nossa sociedade e sempre atenta a seu compromisso com essa nossa sociedade, com a nossa cidade, nosso Estado, nosso país, com as nossas relações com outras instituições mundo afora e contribuindo, assim, para que nós possamos fazer uma construção conjunta de uma sociedade mais inclusiva, mais justa e mais equânime. Essa é um desejo, um anseio nosso e essa é uma missão da nossa instituição como universidade pública, que teve, ao longo desses 93 anos de existência, atuado de forma contundente na defesa, nas demandas, na defesa dos direitos humanos e nas demandas da sociedade que são trazidas para nós, principalmente nesse momento dessa pandemia de tão difícil enfrentamento para todos nós. Eu gostaria de concluir minha fala mais uma vez, agradecendo a todos que se envolveram para que essa cátedra pudesse se concretizar aqui na nossa UFMG, fazendo uma rede de solidariedade, uma rede de acolhida que é tão importante para a UFMG e para várias universidades, instituições públicas do nosso país. Então, esse é um momento que nós temos que pensar muito de forma colaborativa, pensarmos muito de forma solidária, para que possamos trabalhar juntos para enfrentar esse momento e para fazer da nossa instituição uma instituição mais inclusiva, como eu mencionei. E eu gostaria de terminar mencionando uma frase de um livro, de um escritor, do qual eu gosto muito, Guimarães Rosa, ex-aluno da UFMG, da área de medicina, que tem uma visão muito importante sobre a vida de um modo geral, e uma reflexão arguta sobre momentos difíceis pelo qual a humanidade passou ao longo dos anos. E ele fala, tem uma frase que eu gosto muito, ele fala: a vida inventa, a gente principia as coisas no não saber porquê e perde o poder da continuação, porque a vida é mutirão de todos, por todos remexida e por todos temperada. É uma fala que eu gosto muito, porque reflete muito o momento no qual nós estamos vivendo, que precisa de ser uma mutirão de todos nós. Nós temos que trabalhar para o enfrentamento dessa pandemia, não adianta nós trabalharmos de forma individual, nós temos que trabalhar de forma colaborativa, isso é uma colaboração entre pessoas, entre instituições, entre países. Nós só vamos vencer essa pandemia de grande impacto social para as populações de todo o mundo, se nós estivermos juntos trabalhando de forma conjunta, de forma articulada, pensando no bem maior, pensando no bem das pessoas, no bem comum, que nos remete, nesse momento, a uma posição de muita solidariedade que é necessário para todos nós. É o UFMG, que é uma universidade solidária, que pensa na sua missão como vetor para ações de uma sociedade melhor, ela faz deste momento um momento marcante da sua história, ao abrir essa acolhida de forma tão importante para todos nós, aos refugiados, apátridas e todos aqueles estrangeiros que precisam dessa acolhida humanitária. Então, o meu mais sincero agradecimento a todos vocês que construíram essa articulação, a Acnur, que nos aceitou como parceiros nessa cátedra, e agradeço muito a todos vocês que estão conosco assistindo essa importante reflexão com a palestra que nós temos. Agradeço o nosso palestrante de hoje, que aceitou o nosso convite para estar aqui e nos falar sobre o campo dos refugiados, estudos sobre refúgio entre teoria e prática, que é o professor Thomas Gammeltoft-Hansen, da Universidade de Copenhagen, na Dinamarca. Muito obrigada, professor, por estar conosco hoje, e eu agradeço a presença, agradeço o convite para estar aqui. Essa é uma ação que me toca muito de perto, e estou muito feliz de podermos estar implementando, mesmo que esse seja um momento tão triste para nós. Mas nós vamos juntos, com muita cooperação entre todos nós, com muita solidariedade, fazendo o que o UFMG sabe fazer de melhor, se manter unida e atuar em prol da nossa sociedade, do nosso país, um país cada vez mais justo, equânime e mais solidário também. Muito obrigada, desejo um ótimo evento a todos e retorno a palavra à nossa mestre de cerimônias, Vanessa. Muito obrigada.
Muito obrigada, professora. Com a palavra, o diretor de Relações Internacionais da UFMG, professor Aziz Tufi Saliba.
Um bom dia a todas e a todos. É para mim uma grande satisfação estar aqui hoje na companhia da nossa reitora, professora Sandra Almeida, do senhor William Torres, do Acnur, da professora Carolina Mulan, e do nosso ilustre convidado, o professor Thomas Gammeltoft-Hansen, para inaugurar a Cátedra Sérgio Vieira de Mello na nossa universidade. Assim como eu vou me valer das palavras da nossa reitora para registrar minha solidariedade a todos que sofreram, que têm sofrido as duras consequências da pandemia, por vezes, inclusive, com a perda de seus entes queridos. A Cátedra Sérgio Vieira de Mello presta homenagem a uma pessoa que, nas palavras do secretário-geral da ONU, Kofi Annan, ao longo de sua carreira, foi um destacado servidor da humanidade, dedicado a aliviar o sofrimento de seus semelhantes, ajudando-os a resolver seus conflitos e a reconstruir sociedades destruídas pela guerra. Eu quero prestar a minha homenagem também a alguns dos responsáveis pela obtenção desta cátedra. As professoras Benigna Maria de Oliveira, Cláudia Maiorga, professor Ulisses Panicê, professora Carolina Mulan, professor Leandro Diniz, professor Tarciso Vago, professora Carla Volpini e meu colega de DRI, meu amigo Davidson Belém, além das minhas ex-orientandas, Joana Pacheco e Mariana Ferola. Eu também tenho de agradecer o apoio da Silvia Corrade e do William Torres, ambos do Acnur. Também tenho de agradecer a nossa reitora, a professora Sandra Almeida, que com entusiasmo abraça as iniciativas que tornam a nossa universidade mais diversa, mais inclusiva, mais internacional. De acordo com a Agência das Nações Unidas para Refugiados, nós temos cerca de 80 milhões de pessoas em todo o mundo que foram forçadas a abandonar seus lares. Isso inclui cerca de 26 milhões de refugiados, metade dos quais tem menos de 18 anos. Existem ainda milhões de apátridas, pessoas às quais foi denegada a nacionalidade e que não têm acesso a direitos básicos como educação, saúde, emprego e sequer a liberdade de ir e vir. Diante de números tão expressivos, nós temos de resistir à sensação de impotência e tentar fazer nossa parte. A cátedra congrega nossos esforços para compreender e minorar o sofrimento daqueles que foram forçados a deixar seus lares. Digo lares e não países, porque, como salientou o escritor moçambicano Mia Couto, encheram a terra de fronteiras, carregaram o céu de bandeiras, mas só há duas nações, a dos vivos e a dos mortos. Sérgio Vieira de Mello compreendia a artificialidade das fronteiras e não se intimidava com a magnitude dos problemas. Seu lar era onde houvesse uma tragédia e ele fosse enviado para ajudar. E, indubitavelmente, ele fez a diferença. Com a cátedra, a UFMG, mais uma vez, como ao longo de sua história, fará a diferença. E, como disse o poeta vietnamita Thich Nhat Hanh, estamos cientes de que somos ondas do mesmo mar, folhas da mesma árvore, flores do mesmo jardim. Meu muito obrigado a todas e todos que nos prestigiam e desejo a vocês um ótimo evento.
Muito obrigada, professor. E agora, com a palavra, o assistente sênior de elegibilidade do Alto Comissariado das Nações Unidas para os Refugiados, a Acnur, no Brasil, senhor William Torres Laureano da Rosa.
Bom dia a todos. É um prazer poder estar aqui com vocês. Gostaria de agradecer muito à professora Sandra, à professora Assis, à professora Carolina, por esta oportunidade de estar aqui e, é claro, por todo esse trabalho que estamos começando com a cátedra. É um prazer enorme, vocês não sabem a satisfação que é poder ter a UFMG conosco. É uma universidade que sempre esteve à frente em atitudes em relação a refugiados e, de fato, sempre colaborou muito com o nosso mandato, né? A pedido da professora Carolina, eu gostaria, então, de fazer uma breve apresentação para vocês sobre a cátedra, algo bastante simples, é claro, porque estamos aqui para ouvir o professor Thomas, a quem agradeço o convite, acho que já veio aqui outras vezes em nossos eventos. Gostaria, então, de ser o mais rápido possível, exatamente para a gente ter uma ideia de quando nós estamos falando de cátedra, o que nós estamos falando, né? Qual é o tipo de trabalho, né? Qual é a forma que a universidade consegue nos ajudar. E já adianto para vocês que de muitas maneiras. A universidade ela é um ator fundamental, né, no trabalho que o Acnur realiza aqui no Brasil e sem o qual nós não teríamos condições de fazer, né? O Acnur, enquanto agência, ele é criado em 1950 com um papel muito importante, né, de fato, de garantir a proteção de refugiados. Então, se percebeu que havia um problema de deslocamento forçado, né, em decorrência de diversos conflitos, especificamente da Segunda Guerra Mundial, e para apoiar essas pessoas que estavam, muitas vezes, sem nacionalidade ou que estavam fugindo do seu próprio país, as Nações Unidas, então, criam uma organização que tem, dentro do seu mandato, essa ideia de garantir, né, que qualquer pessoa possa exercer o direito de buscar e receber o asilo em outro país e, se desejar, eventualmente, de retornar para o seu país de origem, né? Então, o Acnur tem as suas ações voltadas, em parte, para garantir essa proteção de refugiados e de promover o que nós chamamos de soluções duradouras, que seria a integração local, né? Então, aquele refugiado que quer permanecer no país de destino, quer permanecer no país de refúgio, algumas ações de reassentamento, quando a pessoa está num país de asilo, mas ela não consegue, de alguma maneira, garantir a sua proteção naquele país, que foi o caso de muitos colombianos que vieram para o Brasil, por exemplo, que estavam antes na Bolívia, mas sofreram perseguições também na Bolívia, então, de alguma forma, foram trazidos para o Brasil num processo que a gente chama de reassentamento, ou ainda, uma vez finda os conflitos ou resolvendo a situação de perseguição, retornar, então, para o seu país de origem. né? E aí trabalhamos com essa população, né, que são refugiados definidos, então, pela nossa Convenção de 1951, aquelas pessoas que estão fora do seu país de origem devido a fundados temor de perseguições, por motivos de raça, religião, nacionalidade, pertencimento a um grupo social específico, ou ainda por questões de opinião política, né? E mais recentemente, por conta de alterações legislativas, a inclusão, então, da Declaração de Cartagena, nós temos essa expansão para o termo de grave e generalizada violação de direitos humanos, que é o que tem dado no Brasil a possibilidade dos venezuelanos virem solicitarem refúgio e terem o seu status reconhecidos, né? Então, nós temos hoje, né, como já disse bem o professor Assis, um grande número de refugiados, de pessoas que estão dentro desse mandato e que, por algum motivo, tiveram que fazer esse deslocamento, tiveram que deixar os seus países por algum dessas razões, né? Então, no Brasil, nós temos muitos casos de angolanos que vieram por conta de guerra civil, de pessoas da Serra Leoa que sofreram por questões de mutilação genital ou que iriam sofrer algum processo de mutilação genital. Nós temos perseguições religiosas, pessoas que são ateias e viviam em país muçulmano, ou uma série de outras questões nesse sentido. Tá? Nós temos hoje, no Brasil, um número de solicitação de refúgio na casa, mais ou menos, de 188 mil solicitações que ainda não foram resolvidas, né? Esses são os dados de novembro de 2020, né? Muitos dos quais são venezuelanos, né? Passando aí por haitianos, cubanos, senegaleses, angolanos, né? Então, pessoas que ainda estão, de alguma forma, aguardando uma decisão, né? Os números brasileiros, eles são bem mais menores, né? Se a gente pegar a realidade mundial, de 80 milhões de pessoas, mas nós temos, sim, uma população importante, que depende um pouco das nossas ações, depende, então, dessa possibilidade, dessa ajuda que vocês possam garantir, podem ajudar e podem, de alguma forma, proteger essas pessoas, né? São mais ou menos 60 mil refugiados que foram reconhecidos, muitos dos quais são venezuelanos, exatamente por conta da situação que passa a Venezuela hoje em dia, e pelo governo brasileiro entender que há uma situação de grave generalizada de violação de direitos humanos, né? Então, que nós temos que dar essa proteção aos refugiados venezuelanos, né? Não só os 100 e poucos mil que são solicitantes de refúgio, o Brasil tem essa portaria interministerial que facilitou a autorização de residência para os venezuelanos, mais ou menos na casa de 150 mil, e outros 45 mil, 46, um pouco mais, de refugiados reconhecidos, né? E nós temos tanto venezuelanos como indígenas Warao, Piemont, entre esses números. Então, uma realidade bastante complexa de como tem realizado dessa situação, né, de deslocamento forçado que vem para o Brasil. O Acnur, nesse caso, os escritórios em geral são pequenos, né? Aqui em São Paulo, do qual eu faço parte, somos 10 pessoas trabalhando por uma área geográfica grande, que vai do Rio Grande do Sul até a Bahia. Então, todas as ações relacionadas pelo Acnur nessa região acaba vindo para o escritório de São Paulo, o escritório em Boa Vista um pouco maior, já com umas 50 pessoas, exatamente por conta da presença ali da fronteira com a Venezuela, a fronteira em Pacaraima, mas todas atuando sempre em prol, então, dessa população que tem chegado, né? Seja pelo aeroporto de Guarulhos, seja pela fronteira em Pacaraima, né? É claro que são poucas pessoas, então o trabalho ele tem que ser realizado por meio de parcerias. Não tem outra forma da gente trabalhar se não for por parcerias sólidas com pessoas que têm o interesse, que têm essa vontade desse trabalho pelo outro, né? E em todos os lugares, na maioria dos estados, vocês vão encontrar algum parceiro do Acnur fazendo esse trabalho ou, de alguma forma, tentando nos apoiar nesse sentido, né? E a Cátedra Sérgio Vieira de Mello, então, é uma dessas parcerias que nós gostamos muito, assim, que eu sou privilegiado, eu sempre digo que eu sou privilegiado de poder trabalhar com a Cátedra, exatamente por tudo aquilo que ela traz de avanço no tema do refúgio, né? Seja na pesquisa, seja no ensino, mas também pela forma como a extensão tem se realizado e como tem conseguido, de alguma forma, apoiar esses refugiados nas diversas localidades, né? A cátedra tem, então, esse objetivo, né, de ser um polo de educação, de pesquisa e de extensão, né, voltado sempre para o trabalho junto com a CNUR e com os temas, né, e os objetivos que nós temos. Ela surge em 2004 com a PUC de São Paulo, né, nesse primeira iniciativa, então, de uma parceria mais formal com as universidades, e depois foi reconhecido por uma série de documentos essa importância, né, dessa relação com as universidades. Por fim, no Pacto Global para Refugiados, em 2019, foi criada, então, uma rede interdisciplinar de universidades que tem essa ideia de apoiar os refugiados, né? Então, a cátedra ela tem uma importância não só local, aqui regional, mas ela ganha uma projeção internacional a partir aí do Pacto Global, né? Hoje são 29 universidades conveniadas, a última que foi conveniada é a Federal de Goiás, então nós estamos em 11 estados, mais o Distrito Federal, trabalhando dessa forma. Alguns estados têm mais universidades, outros têm menos, mas de alguma forma a capilarização que a cátedra tem, ela é importantíssima para o trabalho que a gente realiza, né? Nós não estamos em Santa Maria, no Rio Grande do Sul, nós não estamos em Belo Horizonte, né? Não temos um escritório físico, mas poder contar, então, com vocês, né, e com as outras universidades é uma vantagem imensa, né? E se nós formos verificar o trabalho que as cátedras têm realizado, vocês vão perceber esse volume, né, assim, de atendimentos ou de como as cátedras, como as universidades, elas têm de alguma forma mobilizado o tema do refúgio e nos trazido, então, esses ganhos, né, para a população que a gente atende, né? Se nós pensarmos em termos de ensino, né, são 149 disciplinas que foram ofertadas no último ano. Esses são os dados do nosso relatório que realizamos anualmente, sendo 83 na graduação e outros 66 na pós-graduação, em 23 cursos diferentes, né? Então, podemos dizer que o tema do refúgio ele sai do âmbito do direito e das relações internacionais e ele ganha, então, um espaço muito grande para poder falar em termos de saúde, na psicologia, na assistência social. Isso tudo acaba, então, de alguma forma, ganhando uma projeção maior, não é? Além disso, você tem o tema, é claro, né, do ingresso facilitado, né? Hoje são 14 universidades, 15 com a Federal de Minas Gerais, que não estava nesse relatório, entrou um pouco depois, né? Mas com algum tipo de edital, algum tipo de ingresso que vem facilitar a entrada dos refugiados no ensino superior, né? Podemos dizer que o último relatório mostra que são 3% somente dos refugiados que poderiam estar na universidade conseguem algum tipo de atuação nesse sentido, né? Então, é um número bastante pequeno, né, de refugiados que conseguem, de alguma forma, entrar no ensino superior, né? Então, nós temos hoje essa facilidade, né? O fato de ter um ingresso facilitado vem, de alguma forma, contribuir com esses números para aumentar a presença de refugiados também no ensino superior, né? Além disso, a questão de revalidação de diplomas é um outro tema importantíssimo, que muitos deles difíceis de ser trabalhado exatamente por conta da legislação nacional, né? Nós sabemos que são as universidades federais que têm esse papel de revalidar o diploma, não é? E aí muitos dos refugiados que chegam ao Brasil, que já têm algum ensino superior, para poderem trabalhar na área em que já tinham, eles dependem dessa revalidação, né? Então, nós também temos, né, aí uma facilitação, digamos assim, que está prevista em lei, que a Lei 9474 ela já traz alguns benefícios ao refugiado, entre eles a questão da revalidação de diploma, né? Então, isso vem de encontro com esse papel nosso de integração local, no momento em que permite que o refugiado possa trazer esse conhecimento que ele já tem, né, do seu país de origem, e aplicá-lo aqui no Brasil também, para que tenha um emprego melhor, com um salário melhor, né, e possa, de fato, de alguma forma, recomeçar a sua vida, né? Agora, além desses atendimentos, né, além dessa questão do ensino, as universidades têm nos ajudado, a partir das pesquisas realizadas, a pensar em políticas públicas, né? A pensar em como nós podemos, de alguma forma, melhorar o trabalho que temos realizado, melhorar alguns temas prioritários que acabam sendo criados nesse sentido, né? São 45 grupos de pesquisas hoje, trabalhando com algum tema sobre refúgio, com quase 600 pesquisadores, entre graduados, mestrados, doutores, sendo que 164 são bolsistas, né, de FAPEMIG, de FAPESP, de FAPERJ, de diversas agências financiadoras, mas de alguma forma trabalhando com isso, né? E aí nos permitindo entender qual o perfil socioeconômico dos refugiados, como que eles têm influenciado na economia, principalmente em Roraima, onde tem um número muito grande de solicitantes de refúgio, né? E isso vai nos ajudando a entender melhor as condições e atuar de forma mais efetiva, né? No tema da extensão, então, nós vamos ter tanto assessoria jurídica, temas de integração laboral, cursos de ensino de português e atendimentos de saúde mental, psicossocial, né, ou mesmo atendimento de saúde geral, em que os refugiados podem acessar e têm um acesso pensado para eles, né? São normalmente atividades em que o refugiado vai encontrar pessoas que têm o conhecimento do tema, que sabem, têm uma sensibilidade, que estão ali para trabalhar por eles, né? Nós tivemos 3.502 atendimentos que as cátedras realizadas em 2020, um número bastante expressivo, 2.000 atendimentos jurídicos ou de assistência legal de alguma forma, né? O mesmo de regularização migratória, de preenchimento de documentação, tudo mais, sendo quase 4.000 vagas em cursos de português que foram oferecidas no ano de 2020. Né? Nós sabemos que o português não é uma língua fácil, não é uma língua difundida, que todo mundo conhece, mas extremamente necessário para que a pessoa possa, de alguma forma, entrar no mercado de trabalho. Né? E, por conta disso, essas 4.000 vagas, muito facilitada por conta da questão da existência, né, do meio eletrônico e por conta do Covid. Então, isso, de alguma forma, facilitou muito o acesso do refugiado a esses né, serviços, digamos assim, né? E algumas universidades, então, ainda, né, entendendo que para o refugiado é difícil a permanência na universidade, sem algum tipo de auxílio, né, elas acabam, de alguma forma, conseguindo algum tipo de recurso ou algum tipo de facilitação para os refugiados. São 19 que tem algum programa de permanência, né, que pode ser desde auxílio moradia, auxílio permanência, auxílio alimentação, a questão da residência estudantil, ou algum tipo de bolsa de estudo, né, que vem nesse encontro, né, nessa compreensão de que não basta que o refugiado entre na universidade, mas que também temos que garantir a permanência dele nos cursos, né, que nem sempre é tão facilitado, né. Além disso, nós conseguimos, nos últimos 12 meses, realizar mais ou menos 77 eventos, né, além de um podcast que foi feito com o apoio das universidades, né, todos nessa expectativa, né, de alguma forma, de levar o tema do refúgio para outros lugares, né, e permitir que o refugiado, que outras pessoas entendam o que é o tema do refúgio, possam se solidarizar também, e de alguma forma, então, também o tema possa ser mais difundido e possa ter outros grupos, outras universidades, outras pessoas que apoiam essa população, né. Como eu disse, eu não quero me estender muito, acho que algumas palavras simples, né, assim, para a gente poder ter um pouco da ideia, né, do papel da universidade, de como esse projeto ele tem nos apoiado, né. Eu agradeço a todos mais uma vez e fico aqui à disposição de vocês para o que for necessário. Muito obrigado e mais uma vez agradeço.
Muito obrigada, Sr. William. E agora com a palavra a coordenadora da Cátedra Sérgio Vieira de Mello, na UFMG, professora Carolina Mulan.
Obrigada, Vanessa. Bom dia a todos e todas. Não vou também me alongar, sei que nós já estamos aí no avançar da hora, queremos passar a palavra rapidamente para o professor Thomas, só queria reiterar o agradecimento pela presença da professora Sandra Regina Almeida nessa né, abertura da nossa cátedra, agradecer ao professor Aziz, professora Cláudia Maiorga, professora Carla Volpini, que lideraram, né, a equipe que propôs esse projeto, todos os docentes técnicos que participaram da comissão que elaborou a resolução, né, a nova resolução para refugiados da UFMG, que trilha, né, em alguma medida também, esse caminho institucional para que a cátedra, né, possa fruir na nossa universidade. Eu queria apenas me colocar aqui à disposição de toda a comunidade acadêmica e da sociedade civil, como ponto focal, né, para que possamos divulgar uma série de iniciativas já em andamento por docentes, técnicos, alunos, com relação a essa população, no ensino, pesquisa e extensão. Então, precisamos, né, tornar essas iniciativas visíveis e articulá-las, e esse é um dos propósitos da cátedra, justamente o de produzir essa rede interna e de ampliar o nosso diálogo com esse conjunto de universidades, de instituições que hoje produzem, né, em alguma medida, as políticas públicas para essa população em nível nacional, mas também e sobretudo, né, em nível estadual e local. Então fica aqui esse meu convite para toda a comunidade de busca, não é, da cátedra como esse espaço, e que quem tiver também disponibilidade, que se some, né, a esse esforço institucional que estamos aqui hoje celebrando em alguma medida, né, e dando o pontapé inicial. Without further ado, I'll move to English to present Professor Thomas Gammeltoft-Hansen from the University of Copenhagen. Thomas is, I can say that now, I think, a long-time partner of the Sérgio Vieira de Mello's refugee chairs in Brazil. He has been with us in previous occasions, and I hope this is the first of a long-term cooperation between Thomas and the Federal University of Minas Gerais. Thomas is professor in migration and refugee law at the University of Copenhagen. He's also honorary professor at Aarhus University, which is also in Denmark. He received his PhD in international law from Aarhus University. He has a master in refugee studies from the University of Oxford and a master in political sciences from the University of Copenhagen. He has published extensively on issues around international refugee and migration law, mobility regulation, the relationship between international law and politics. And among the several journal articles and books, I will highlight here his groundbreaking book, Access to Asylum, International Refugee Law and the Globalization of Migration Control, published with Cambridge University Press in 2011. There has been a central contribution to the field, the refugee studies field. He's series editor of the Routledge Studies in Human Rights, also on the editorial board for Cambridge Asylum and Migration Studies. But aside from his scholarship, he's also been a very active commentator and advocate for refugees' rights. He has been a consultant for a number of international organizations, including UNHCR, has served as previously as a member of the Danish Refugee Appeals Board, which is similar to, somewhat different, but has a similar function as the National Refugee Board in Brazil. So I would like to thank Thomas for being with us, for bearing with the introduction in Portuguese, and I'll pass the floor to you, Thomas.
Thank you very much. And thank you for this very kind introduction, Carolina. Thank you, President Almeida, Dean Assis Saliba, William Laureano, and your team for inviting me to give this inaugural lecture. It is a great, great pleasure for me to join the Cátedra again, if sadly, this time only virtually. For reasons that will soon be apparent in my talk, I think the existence of this new de Mello academic chair at the Federal University of Minas Gerais and the vibrant and highly interdisciplinary environment of refugee scholarship around it is an extremely valuable contribution to both refugee studies and to support the ongoing and unfortunately ever important work of refugee protection both in Brazil and elsewhere. And the fact that we are at an important point in the development of international refugee protection is a terse one, but an important one. We see this not only in the constantly growing numbers of global displacement, including in Brazil, but also in the face of the ongoing pandemic, which has brought about additional and in many cases devastating challenges to current protection efforts and refugees' ability to move and seek protection. This last year has witnessed several instances of open disregard for core obligations under the 1951 Convention in many different parts of the world, but also repeated questioning of the sort of core legal framework of refugee law itself and the value of refugee protection as a frame through which to broker different political deals regarding refugees and migrants. These developments have further prompted strong but also different responses from refugee academics. While there's agreement, of course, that blatant violations of international refugee law are unacceptable, scholars also differ in their approach to countering them. Some academics are getting involved in various forms of activism. Others have launched bold reform proposals in the hope to rekindle state support for refugee protection. And around the world, refugee scholars also disagree on whether and how best to engage the ongoing national, regional, and global policy processes surrounding refugee protection. While practice-oriented dialogues have arguably always been a core feature of refugee scholarship, more voices today approach these links between the practical and the academic from a more critical perspective, arguing that any kind of solution-oriented input from scholars has an inherent risk of being corrupted in the ensuing political process. And meanwhile, narratives of crisis and refugee crisis have led both policymakers and colleagues from other disciplines to question the traditionally central role of refugee law and also legal academics in the negotiation and governance of domestic and global refugee policy. Some refugee scholars further experience not only that their own field of study, refugee studies, but also their person and academic credibility have become the subject of politicization and critique. So in this current environment, we see a production of different and sometimes difficult ethical, academic, and political choices for scholars engaged with refugees. And navigating these choices requires a nuanced understanding, not only of the political realities at stake for refugees, but also of the contours and constitution of refugee studies as an academic field. So this is the issue that I want to address today. For fields so intimately related to the political world around it, I believe that this is a very important time to reflect on the development and current state of refugee studies. I'll be doing so primarily from the vantage point of my own discipline, which is law, but I hope and believe that many of the issues apply equally to refugee scholars from other disciplines. And notably, and this is perhaps one of the most significant differences between refugee law and refugee studies more generally, there really isn't much tradition for that kind of introspection in refugee law scholarship, except for a few key pioneering articles and the occasional side remark or footnote in editorials. I know of no systematic attempts to reflect on the field of refugee law scholarship as such. And let me just share some slides with you now. My talk today and my interest in what might be seen as the kind of sociology of science of refugee studies is based on a joint project with a colleague, Rosemary Byrne, professor at NYU, Abu Dhabi. And at the very outset, our interest in sort of reflecting on our own discipline and field of study was met by a methodological challenge. Of course, we ourselves being deeply embedded as practitioners in this field. That, of course, may lead to an advantage in terms of knowledge, but it could also mean that it's often very hard to maintain a critical distance necessary as part of an academic endeavor. So we deliberately decided to take a rather, you could say, data-driven approach, allowing for empirical findings that would and should surprise us and require maybe a reassessment also of our own core assumptions as scholars. And the very first output from this project was published not long ago as an article in the International Journal of Refugee Law, a co-authored piece by both of us. And I'm very happy that, and we both were, that the International Journal of Refugee Law, as the sort of leading journal on the topic of refugee law, accepted the article, since the hope of this work and of the talk today was very much to introduce and kindle a more reflexive conversation among refugee law scholars in this environment. The theoretical starting point that we take for our analysis is that refugee studies constitutes what some Bourdieusian sociologists would call, quote, a weak field. And it's important for me to underline that weak in this context has a very specific meaning. It should not be misunderstood or misinterpreted as implying lacking influence or lacking academic standing. On the contrary, rather it connotes the particular academic field's relationship to other areas of scholarship, as well as wider societal and political structures. According to Bourdieu, the relative autonomy of any academic field depends on both its relationship to, you could say, dominant political and economic forces, and its relative independence within the university system and of its educational system. So the very institutionalization and introduction of this chair is sort of a marker of this kind of institutionalization and empowerment. At the same time, however, weak fields are characterized by a relatively low degree of academic institutionalization. These tend to be less independent or secluded from external non-academic interests. And refugee studies, par excellence, exhibit both these traits. First of all, like many other, so it's certainly not unique to refugee studies, but like many other multidisciplinary academic fields, for instance, EU studies, human rights, refugee studies is intimately linked to the disciplines in which its participants are trained. So very unsurprisingly, many methodological, theoretical developments in refugee studies tend to mirror broader trends within the respective disciplines from which they're engaged. Secondly, refugee studies, and I might say in particular, my own part of refugee studies, refugee law, retains very close connections to professional communities outside of the university or academia. This is true at the individual level, where we see sort of what is often referred to as revolving door dynamics or double hatting as being very commonplace, academics transiting from an academic position to a more policy or practical one and then back again, or having different roles at the same time. So many refugee scholars take on part-time or temporary assignments for refugee organizations, serve as advisors or consultants, or practice or adjudicate asylum and immigration cases, everything that Carolina just said that I have done as well. So I'm one of them. But this is also something of a relationship that characterizes the field at large. A substantial percentage of research funding in refugee studies derive from what you might say is policy-oriented donors as opposed to basic science foundations. Looking through the editorial boards of leading refugee and migration journals, you find various international organizations well represented, interestingly more so than in other related fields, like, for instance, human rights studies. If we take the example of the journal International Migration, it's even published by the International Organization of Migration itself, and dedicated academic tracks often organized as part of international policy processes. Refugee scholarship, in other words, is not simply a free-floating intellectual history, but very much a product of and a response to surrounding political developments. And there's nothing exceptional about this. One would find many of the same traits in other academic fields, as mentioned, human rights or security studies. And one could further argue that this kind of relationship holds true for pretty much all fields of law to some degree, reflecting this old relationship between law as an academic discipline and the political world in which the law applies. At the same time, however, the particular way this relationship unfolds within refugee studies has and continues to have important implications for how scholarship develops and how our field is structured. If refugee scholars are generally orientated towards policy and practice, the opposite holds true as well. Refugee professionals, refugee organizations tend to be deeply invested in research and academic production, as William just showed us. Today, several refugee organizations maintain a form of internal research capacity. The UNHCR, to take an example, established an evaluation and policy unit all the way back in 1999, along with a dedicated research working paper series. UNHCR has further provided financial and other forms of support to countless different research projects and educational platforms, for instance, the Refugee Law Reader. And so again, the occasion of this very lecture is testimony to that. The academic chair network that we just saw in memory of Sergio Vieira de Mello were first established some 16, 17 years ago at the explicit initiative of UNHCR's Regional Office for South and Latin America, and with a stated aim of involving governments, university and international organizations in a joint partnership to broaden human rights related academic programs. We might look at journals as another case in point, and specifically the International Journal of Refugee Law. Like other practice-oriented law journals, the Journal of Refugee Law regularly publish relevant policy documents, and UNHCR is represented at the editorial board. Some of the most prolific contributors of articles to the journal are formally non-academics. That doesn't just go for policy documents, but also for the research articles. And if you examine the entire corpus of scholarly articles, and specifically actually the number of research articles, no book reviews or policy documents, it shows that some 40% of articles stem from authors formally affiliated with non-academic institutions. This also means that if we look geographically at which institutions dominate scholarly production in a journal like the International Journal of Refugee Law, we find all the usual suspects. Institutions like Oxford and York, as well as other universities where there are long established and strong centers for refugee scholarship. But it also confirms a more concerning trend, namely that refugee law scholarship is overwhelmingly dominated and driven by scholars in the global north. None of the institutions in the top 10 of contributors is placed in the global south. On top of this, the list is overwhelmingly Anglophone. The trend is much the same for other journals, even non-legal journals. So to take another case, the Journal of Refugee Studies, two colleagues, Rachel McNally and Nadia Rahim, recently conducted a similar analysis of this journal, showing that more than 90% of the scholarship was produced in the global north. And if we break down contributions to the Journal of Refugee Studies by population size, we actually find that Nordic countries like my own are relatively dominating, or at least overrepresented in the field. And perhaps most fundamentally problematic, contributions to refugee studies are nearly inversely correlated to the countries and regions where the majority of refugees reside. So this represents a clear imbalance and further has substantive implications for how this scholarship develops, as it tends to overemphasize and reproduce an empirical focus on refugees in the global north, especially in Europe, while most refugees, of course, are located in the global south. Going back to the International Journal of Refugee Law, another more surprising and I think key finding is that UNHCR as an organization is actually the second largest institutional contributor. Again, this only actually concerns research articles. On top of that come other things like policy documents. So how can we explain the intense and heavy involvement of the professional refugee community in the scholarly production of refugee studies? Most obviously, it may be argued to reflect the relatively weak institutionalization of refugee studies. Contrary to, for instance, human rights and the human rights regime, where prominent scholars have different options to serve as, for instance, mandate holders, committee members, or judges within the UN or regional human rights architecture, there are few such positions that exist beyond the national level in regard to refugee law and refugee studies. At the same time, the refugee regime has always suffered from the absence of an international court or a dedicated treaty committee or any kind of national institution to support international refugee law regime. And so this also makes the academic field all the more important venue through which to seek support and guidance in regard to legal interpretation. So the active participation by refugee advocates and international organizations in scholarly activities may also be seen to reflect the centrality that scholarship has always had in negotiating and progressively developing refugee protection principles. This is supported by the different examples where academic interpretations have subsequently found favor in domestic courts or actively influenced state practice. And the close relationship between refugee professional scholars are also evident in the final draft of the Global Compact for Refugees, which William also showed us, which calls on UNHCR to help establish a global academic network. And of course, that kind of open dialogue, and you could say cross-fertilization between academia and practice, is a major strength of any academic field engaged in empirically based and you might say problem-solving research. Within law specifically, it further helps academics retain a better understanding of ongoing policy processes, exemplified by articles by leading policy figures in the field, including UNHCR staff, as well as the reasoning behind, for instance, particular legal outcomes or how academic opinions are received by legal decision makers, as exemplified by very important contributions to some of these journals by commentators also serving in an everyday role as refugee judges at the national or regional level. And so this interplay between academia and practice is something to be valued, but it can also in some contexts give rise to concerns and critical considerations. First of all, the narrow interface between scholarship and practice is very much centered around a handful of major international organizations. And this can, of course, make it more difficult for scholars to voice criticism regarding the role of these central institutions within the refugee regime. Historically, scholars who have done so have often found themselves standing on the outside of these important fora and research where these organizations play a major role. This is particularly important at a time where organizations like UNHCR and IOM are both leading major policy debates at both the regional and international levels. And I believe it's paramount that such debates are not co-opted by particular institutional political interests, and that institutions that are powerful and play a powerful role in the academic field do not abuse their position to exclude scholars critical of their own work. Secondly, and related, it's important to ask questions in terms of how this relationship is being brokered. Who among refugee scholars are included? Who are excluded? This includes things like geographical representation that we just spoke about before. International refugee law, perhaps even more so than other disciplines in refugee studies, have really struggled to include perspectives from the Global South. But it's also a matter of what kind of academic outlooks and what kind of academic positions get to be represented. As one of the pioneering scholars in this particular field and a powerhouse of both trail approaches to international law and refugee studies, B.S. Chimney has pointed out, the strong ties to UNHCR has at least historically tended to favor particular kinds of research and approaches, which lend itself more easily to policy purposes. But refugee studies today arguably represents a constantly growing and always sprawling field. So many scholars today have more explicitly tried to distance themselves from, you could say, preconceived policy approaches in their research. Within my own discipline, that might mean, for instance, taking a non-positivist approach to refugee law, and try to push back against the perceived limits of acceptable interpretive outcomes that may pertain to policy commissioned research. In their place, scholars have instead tried to apply a range of different theoretical approaches to both refugee law and other parts of refugee studies, including, for instance, critical legal theory, post-colonial and third world approaches, feminist theory, realism, law and economics, and transnational law, just to name a few. In that context, a very welcome development is that the Global Compact for Refugees specifically mentions regional diversity and expertise from a broad range of subject areas in its engagement with researchers and universities on matters of refugees, forced displacement, and statelessness. Last but not least, I think it's relevant to ask how and who set the parameters for shared research agendas across practice and scholarship. While funding for refugee research has significantly increased in recent years, at least in many parts of the world, much of this funding is also at the same time attached to predefined and very specific requirements in terms of policy outcomes and impacts. Looking at some of these calls for funding, one fears that this kind of policy-driven research may well be too narrowly circumscribed by very current and specific political outlooks and objectives. More generally, research commissioned or edited by agencies and political entities is often subject to very specific here and now knowledge needs that may ultimately limit its wider policy impact and application over time. As refugee scholar Oliver Bakewell has pointed out, there is a case to be made by having more seemingly policy irrelevant research, but which is in fact research that can challenge existing categories and priorities of policymakers and practitioners in terms of how they frame research questions and subject areas. Refugee research is secondly characterized by what has been dubbed a dual imperative. An imperative to simultaneously undertake rigorous research and at the same time to promote refugee rights and agency. This is a natural extension of the field's subject matter. As David Turton has pointed out, it's fundamentally difficult to justify research into a situation of extreme human suffering unless the alleviation of that suffering is also an explicit objective of one's research agenda. This applies to legal scholarship as well, where, for instance, Guy Goodwin Gill has argued that international refugee scholarship should never be just academic, divorced from the real problems of refugee protection. However, brokering this dual imperative is not always straightforward and can sometimes lead to competing demands on scholars. This comes out most clearly in the internal struggles over interpretation fought through claims about internal legal methodology. Hence, in refugee law, we often left with a plethora of self-proclaimed positivist approaches, striking very different balances between, on the one hand, more dynamic interpretations or emphasis on the object or purpose of the Refugee Convention, versus, on the other hand, more sovereigntist approaches, an emphasis on state practice and general principles of international law. And accordingly, these purpose-driven approaches have been, sometimes at least, criticized for failing to adhere to core interpretive standards and hence amount to little more than what some lawyers have derided as, quote, wishful legal thinking. James Hathaway, for instance, has famously taken issue with both important UNHCR commissioned research and parts of the wider turn to human rights and refugee law for overstating the reach of refugee law commitments and its construction of opinion juris and regime interaction. At the same time, however, Hathaway's own modern positivist approach to international refugee law was itself rejected by certain scholars, including Kai Heilbronner, for failing to take full account of more restrictive state practices as part of interpretation. The book that Carolina kindly mentioned at the outset, my own volume on access to asylum, was similarly criticized by some reviewers for not striking exactly the right balance. The point here that I want to make today is not to try and resolve any or all of these different disagreements, but rather to simply recognize how legal interpretation is necessarily influenced by subjective outlooks, reflecting, at least in part, this underlying tension between advocacy and academic rigor. And this is a tension that has shaped refugee law scholarship in several different areas. As Gregor Knoll notes, the battle over the proper interpretation of refugee law, in this case, the geographical application of the non-refoulement commitment, can no longer be won on a substantial level. The decisive arguments are those relating to the interpretation of interpretive rules, and as such, a matter of academic politics. It might be tempting for scholars to keep pushing at the frontiers of interpretation in order to expand the scope of protection and rein in new and more restrictive state practices. At the same time, however, there's always a risk that strongly advocacy-driven approaches also risk undermining support for refugee law and refugee law scholarship as such. And this is one of the dilemmas that one needs to deal with as a refugee scholar today, given the political context of this very field. Secondly, how we as scholars navigate this dual imperative also has implications for the field's relationship to the broader disciplines of which refugee studies is composed. These years, academic discussions over interpretation and what constitutes good scholarship often take place at the national levels between, for instance, refugee law scholars and colleagues from other parts of the legal discipline. And as pointed out by scholars from other disciplines of refugee studies, there is a centripetal orientation towards the field that can lead to accusations of methodological sloppiness from colleagues within the wider disciplines. Hence, as scholars, we need to engage actively with peer critique by clearly setting out and actively justifying the methodological choices important to ensure that refugee studies is not marginalized or seen as developing out of touch with other parts of the disciplines of which it is composed. The dual imperative finally matters in terms of how scholars position themselves and respond to new policy measures. Whereas previously, international organizations could generally count on support from scholars in regard to major policy processes, the more restrictive climate for refugees in the last decades means that more refugee scholars are taking up a distinctly more critical position, from the outset challenging what can be achieved within the parameters of existing political mandates and procedures. And from this vantage point, some scholars have instead launched alternative reform proposals based on both more idealist or more realist conceptions. Other scholars, again, have become more directly involved in refugee advocacy, and several universities have, in the last 5 years, opened new clinics for refugees and asylum seekers. Each of these strategies are valid, but at the same time, also open to internal contestation. Those choosing to stand outside policy process, for instance, the process surrounding the Global Compact for Refugees, have argued that these initiatives tend to be clouded by institutional interests or may not be sufficiently likely to prove effective. Vice versa, various reform proposals launched by academics have been accused of either being too far removed from the practical realities of states as to have any impact, or vice versa, inherently apologetic to the interest of powerful states, open to misuse or partial application. It's not for me today to say what's right and wrong. Like each of you, I've made my own choices over the years. My point here is rather that what for most refugee scholars used to be a simpler issue, namely how to balance this dual imperative, is arguably open to a range of positions depending on both one's theoretical and political outlook. This brings me to my last point. Law, and refugee law specifically, has traditionally maintained a somewhat privileged position, both within global refugee policy and consequently also within refugee studies as an academic field. Yet, despite the continued support and sort of formal endorsement of the 1951 Refugee Convention by governments, it is hard these days not to escape a feeling that this privileged position of refugee law and of refugee lawyers is currently changing. Not just because adherence to existing legal standards is faltering in many places, that is hardly something new, but more fundamentally because international law and legal expertise may also be argued to be losing turf in the ongoing discussions of global refugee policy in favor of often more political, economic, or other modes of governance. The Refugee Compact for Refugees is a case in point. Not only did states expressly reject to submit themselves to any new legal commitments, leading to the present and somewhat diplomatic neologism of a compact as opposed to a protocol or new convention, which is a term previously reserved to entice more voluntary pledges from corporate CEOs. But reading the text itself, it also immediately becomes clear that references to legal standards and commitments are more scant, and that the text is more concerned about technical and procedural aspects of refugee governance. Distinct disappointment with law as this dominant mode of governance in regard to refugees has further been expressed by some scholars within other parts of refugee studies. In their book, Refugee, Alexander Betts and Paul Collier, for instance, argue that, and I quote, refugee law is no longer effective, and that, quote, its relevance should be an empirical question, not an assumption. And several governments seem to mirror that position, specifically seeking out expertise from other fields and disciplines, sometimes outside what would be the circle of people self-identifying as refugee scholars. In a recent essay, David Cantor thus provocatively raised the question whether refugee law has, quote, outlived its utility, and whether we may be seeing the, quote, end days of refugee law. And to provide a partial answer, I think it might be useful to take a look back on the trajectory of refugee scholarships. And doing so will tell us that frustration, specifically with refugee law and refugee lawyers, is far from a recent phenomenon. Scholars from other disciplines have long questioned the extent to which legal commitments actually translate into protection on the ground for refugees. For instance, the former Grand Dame of refugee studies, Barbara Howell Bond, was often a vocal critic of refugee lawyers and their lack of attention to refugee agency. Another social science scholar, Howard Edelman, writing in 1995, describes, quote, international lawyers concerned with refugees as the superegos of the refugee world, end quote. And according to Guy Goodwin Gill, the former High Commissioner for refugees, Sadako Ogata, openly proclaimed her disdain for lawyers, whom she perceived as, quote, rigid and backwards looking, invoking the past to frustrate the realistic and pragmatic approaches to refugee problems, which are considered to be the proper realm of the political scientists as pro-activist humanitarian. So the point here is that this kind of frustration is often directly related to periods in time where we have rapidly or significantly shifting policy agendas related to refugee protection. When states start systematically probing the boundaries of their legal commitments or existing principles fail to meet current political fashions, it is very often law and lawyers that tend to be among those first blamed. And so struggles over the relative importance of refugee law and legal expertise is almost something to be expected, not least in times where existing policy paradigms are failing and new ones being tested. Secondly, just a cursory reading or quick statistical look, in this case, an Ingram analysis at the academic literature highlights that for at least the last 3 decades, different claims of refugee crisis have been near ubiquitous, both within the legal and wider refugee scholarship. Going back, it's clear that refugee scholarship has itself actively co-produced claims about crisis. In other words, crisis does not necessarily spend the end of refugee studies, but is rather integral to its development. This also highlights that claims of crisis tends to carry with it a productive element. If claims of refugee crisis, whether fictive or real, are testing the applicability and relevance of, for instance, refugee law, it can also spawn progressive developments as lawyers and other scholars respond to these new challenges. Going back to the etymological roots of the word crisis as applied by doctors in ancient Greece, law, and in this case, refugee law, may also serve as a sort of immunological response that may or may not lead to the decisive turning points. More fundamentally, it underscores that contrary to B.S. Chimney and Fukuyama's End of History, which David Cantor's article was clearly inspired by, the outcome of these political legal struggles in the context of refugee crisis are never determined in advance. While B.S. Chimney convincingly argued how politics structured dominant positions within refugee studies during the Cold War, an analysis of the subsequent period arguably paints a rather different picture. The development of international refugee law during the current deterrence paradigm has largely been characterized by strategies of resistance to dominant political forces. So, crisis challenges as refugee scholars to look beyond the status quo. The turn to, for instance, human rights as part of refugee law was never incidental, but a response to new flows of refugees and to more restrictive policies around the world. The same can be said for subsequent engagement in litigation through a broad range of legal mechanisms pertaining to different parts of both national and international law. While some of these avenues may now be facing challenges, and we are now discussing backlash also in the area of, for instance, international human rights law, new advances are simultaneously being made by scholars, including many of you also in Brazil. I take great comfort in the wealth of approaches forwarded by refugee scholars, both in the global south and in the global north, that actively explore links to other legal regimes, such as, for instance, international criminal law, humanitarian law, and climate law, and explore different domestic, both legal and non-legal approaches in terms of how to challenge and rein in existing state practices and violations of refugee law. By way of conclusion, I'd like to raise some open-ended questions. First, while I'm personally deeply committed to both academia and practice, and have worked most of my life in institutions with both a policy and a research mandate, I think it's relevant to ask ourselves whether the particular way this relationship between scholarship and practice is being organized within refugee studies can also have unfortunate side effects in terms of marginalizing scholarly perspectives that are either theoretically, geographically, or politically don't conform to the mainstream agenda. And if so, how do we work to ensure and avoid perpetuating this in the present context? Secondly, while I assume nobody of you listening thinks that refugee scholarship should be a question of either or between academic rigor and advocacy, I often find myself struggling to balance this dual imperative, not just in my academic work, but also in terms of how I engage with and respond to new policy initiatives. So I want to raise the question here, and for you in the cátedra, to challenge you to find other and maybe better ways to this in regard to the current challenges to refugee protection. Or should we rather take solace in a form of pluralism and insist on academic standards as a common frame for constructive disagreements on how we engage with political developments? Last but not least, I wonder if there's a need for a more explicit anchoring of different forms of refugee scholarship in terms of the underlying disciplines and the theories infusing them. This is a point that was raised many years ago by one of the few pioneers that have sort of taken on a more reflexive approach to refugee law scholarship, namely Colin Harvey in 1999. Even if from a somewhat different perspective, also more recently by David Cantor in the article mentioned from a few years ago. And reading these two pieces, almost 20 years apart, side by side, it seems almost as if not much has happened between then and now. Reading the old 1990s debate on various reformulation projects and proposals, much of it could just as well have been published today. In other words, how do we avoid simply reinventing the wheel? This was my remarks this afternoon. Again, many, many congratulations on the new cátedra and the chair. And for my part, muito obrigado for listening to me.
Eu queria, do you hear me, Thomas? I wanted to thank you again for your presentation. It was a very thought-provoking discussion on, I think, some of the challenges and limits of our of the interplay between research, scholarship, and practice in refugee law. I think you pointed out to the challenge in the relationship between autonomy, right, of our autonomy of research, and at the same time the need to cooperate and be socially relevant. And this is a balance that's never easy to tackle, especially when we're dealing with populations that are in conditions of forced displacement. I have two questions that I think somewhat, I know our time is we're running out of time, but just two quick questions that I think reflect a little bit on some of the comments our audience has made through YouTube, our YouTube channel. One has to do with the fact that the refugee condition, if we can say it that way, the refugee figure is a highly mediated form of political subjectivity, right? So there is a lot, it's not just that UNHCR and states regulate movement, but they also somehow control who gets to be included, who doesn't get to be included, what types of assistance they get. So that perhaps puts the refugee figure in a very specific place in relation to this institutional systems of power. And so one question that came out is the fact that in order to do a scholarship, somehow we need access to that population, and that access to that population is somehow mediated by the same institutions that somehow regulate what the agenda is. So the gatekeepers are the policymakers, and they're also the data drivers, right? So how do we negotiate that very complicated balance? How do you see that, being yourself someone that has been on both sides of those equations? So this is one question. The second has to do with the impact of those inequalities that you just mentioned on publications, the difficulties and absence of refugees themselves in the processes that relate to not just the construction of knowledge about their condition, but also in the construction of public policies, et cetera, et cetera. But it also relates to the issue of the political economy of refugee protection, humanitarian assistance. There was a question about the Brazilian current policies regarding Venezuelans, and the fact that many of the contract and the contractors, we don't know who they are. It's very hard to access where the money is going, how it's being spent. So how do you see the connection between what you've just said and this general distribution of resources, or what we can call this political economy of refugee processes? Especially considering that when we talk about UNHCR and the big agencies, IOM, they are driven by an emergency mindset that, as you just pinpointed, scholarship somewhat also reverberates and helps to perpetuate. So I think I'll stop there and I'll pass to you.
Thank you very much, Carolina. Two excellent questions and not easy ones to answer. You're putting me on the spot here. As to your first question on gatekeeping, and the construction of the refugee subject and population and mechanisms of inclusion and exclusion. I think it's very interesting to see how actually this is a key point in which refugee studies seem to be divided and to some extent divided across disciplines. Whereas, I mean, for a number of years and for several decades, there was a push within refugee studies, especially the social science part of refugee studies and scholars coming from development, to reconnect more strongly with, you could say, the sort of adjacent field of migration studies. And so we had, for instance, the previous degree of master in refugee studies in Oxford renamed a master in forced migration. We had conferences on forced migration, and it was interesting because it was very easy to see why it was important to expand and to take account of populations that had hitherto been marginalized in policy discussions, including internally displaced or persons forcibly displaced but falling outside of the legal definitions. But he also became subject to a certain pushback, especially from some legal scholars who said, well, if we do this, we risk at the same time, you can say, leaving the sort of strong brands that we stand on, which is the fact that there is indeed a legal refugee and a legally binding refugee protection regime that we can stand on, and that if we lose sight of that and move too fast towards expanding our conceptualizations and approaches to forced migration, that it can come at a price, as seen from a more legal perspective. And that led to some very, very interesting debates, including, for instance, a piece by James Hathaway that was originally delivered in, I think, 2005 at the International Association for the Study of Forced Migration conference as a keynote, which was called Refugee Studies and Forced Migration, Should We Agree Just Today? It's also published as an article. And so you can kind of trace these, you can say, difficulties all along the way. And then there's the second part of your question, that might be sort of part of the conceptual answer. And I don't think there is a clear-cut answer to the conceptual side of your question. But to the practical side on gatekeeping, I think my strongest or my best attempt towards an answer would be what I alluded to a little bit in the conclusion, namely that a field characterized by pluralism, by a sufficient variety of scholars, both working within and clearly outside of these, you can say, gatekeeping structures, is in many ways, I think, that the best guarantee that it doesn't get lopsided in one direction or the other. If everybody would sort of distance themselves from these both governmental and organizational and other political structures that can take on these and do take on these gatekeeping functions, we would be at an immense loss in terms of both access, but also impact in terms of influencing, as refugee studies has, these organizations and the policy directions of both states and practical refugee work. Vice versa, if everyone would remain, or the large part of the field remains too dependent on them, we risk coming in a position where there's simply not that space for critical voice. I'm a scholar who's also been spending a number of years working in the human rights field more generally, and in human rights research institution. And we've seen sort of very similar dynamics happen there, as especially the turn and the emergence of more critical approaches to human rights theory in both history and law, etc., was very sort of actively excluded from the purview of these research institutions as a result of their funding structures, their outlook, their relationship to stakeholders, etc. And it's only really in recent years that there have been work, and I was myself part of it when I was chairing the Association of Human Rights Researchers, to try and really reconnect those different branches. And I would hate to see that happen in refugee studies. I don't think we are at the same risk in refugee studies because, quite frankly, the relationship, the structure is different. There is a space for critical research in refugee studies to a larger degree, maybe in some of these other cases. Now, to your second question on the political economy of sort of funding, etc. I mean, part of my motivation with this project was really to provoke an active discussion on these very structures. And I hope my talk today has made just a small contribution to that. I think the very first step is indeed to kind of lay bare the political economy of both the scholarly production, but also other forms of refugee protection programs. I have seen in recent years many other colleagues move in the same direction, thankfully. So we've got some excellent research being carried out, both in regard to refugee studies, but also, I think, excellent work carried out in terms of really, you could say, following the money in terms of what is being paid for, how are money being spent, what goes into, for instance, EU funding to migration that is being turned from development purposes into more migration management purposes around different parts of the world, especially in the African region. So I think that kind of, and the kind of acknowledgement that we need space for that kind of research, that kind of research is always going to be important. It's part of what anchors refugee studies as a field of study, and it should be actively welcomed, if, in my opinion, also by refugee organizations supporting refugee research. I closely followed and was involved myself in the process surrounding negotiating the Global Compact for Refugees. It was very enriching experience. And time and time again, I encountered sort of discussions over, for instance, the turn to more data-driven approaches in UNHCR. And I think it's one of the, in a sense, rarely directly mentioned, but underlying developments in much of the practical refugee work. Not just UNHCR, but many other organizations are applying much more sophisticated methods for empirically documenting not just their own work, but also the realities of refugee protection. But of course, and what I was discussing with many UNHCR staff has been that it's not always been an easy process. Data is a double-edged sword. If data doesn't always show what you want it to do, empirically driven research does not always come to the conclusions that you hoped for. And at best, we can negotiate in terms of how we frame the research question, how we make sure that we are inclusive when it comes to the sort of taking into account the different empirical materials, the data, the way we construct it. But it is and never will be research if we know the conclusion in advance.
Thank you so much, Thomas. I want to thank everyone for coming. Please circulate the link for anyone interested. Eu gostaria novamente de agradecer a presença do professor Thomas Gammeltoft, inaugurando, né, a Cátedra Sérgio Vieira de Mello da UFMG e do Alto Comissariado das Nações Unidas, agradecer ao querido William Laureano, que tem sido um parceiro importante junto ao escritório do Acnur no Brasil, os professores Aziz Saliba, Davidson Belém, Benigna, Cláudia Maiorga, Carla Volpini, que foram, né, e toda a comissão da resolução, mais uma vez, e a nossa querida reitora, a professora Sandra Regina Almeida, que é uma liderança, né, muito importante para nós, que tem nos conduzido nesse momento muito difícil, né, para o Brasil, para o mundo, e em particular para a pesquisa científica e para as universidades. Então fica aqui o meu abraço, meu voto de saúde e imunidade para todos em 2021. Deixo, né, o meu contato, já coloquei aí no YouTube o contato da Cátedra Temporária, o nosso e-mail, para quem tiver interesse, se aproximar das nossas atividades, quiser divulgar, buscar parcerias, né, estamos à disposição. E também deixo aí o aviso para o nosso edital, né, o edital da Prograde, de vagas para refugiados e imigrantes, que se abre, né, amanhã, ou hoje, né, acho que abriu hoje a inscrição, e ficará aí aberto para essa população até fevereiro. Então, qualquer dúvida também, nós da Cátedra permanecemos à disposição de todos. Thanks again, Thomas. Stay safe, stay healthy, and thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you for having me. I hope to return very shortly, and I wish all of you listening today and all of you and part of the Cátedra and at the UFMG all the very best. Please stay safe. Thank you very much.
Goodbye, everyone.
Goodbye.